Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a pre-release analysis on Nahida. As usual, a lot of it is subject to change. If you're basing your decision on whether or not to pull on how strong the unit is, make sure you tune into my stream or watch my post-release video, which I will release before Nahida's banner is gone. Don't rush into it if you're pulling strictly for strength. If you're pulling because you like the character, go right ahead, I won't stop you. But if it is for strength, wait until there's been actual testing done. So now that we've gotten most of the potential things you can do out of the way, let's move on to the builds and shit. Let's look at the catalysts we have. Let's start by getting out of the way the things that I will not be looking at. Memory of Dust gives a lot of attack and nothing else. If you use her on field, you have better options. If you use her off field, you have better options. I mean, a lot of which are just 4-star weapons. Nahida is a character that has attack scalings, but also has EM scalings, which means that generally EM weapons, damage weapons, and crit weapons will just outperform attack weapons by too much. Fruit of Fulfillment, which is the new prototype, we're also not going to talk about very much because as ER gives EM at the cost of attack, but the amount of EM it gives is less than Magic Guide, and the ER is useless. I think the other ones are all worth talking about. 1,000 Floating Dreams, signature, Fog. However, and this is very important, it's not even always going to be her best choice. Generally it will be, but there is another weapon that just synergizes with her kit really well. If we go back to Nahida, her burst doesn't deal any damage, talents don't deal any damage, and if you play her off field, neither do her normal attacks. So there's one part of her kit that deals damage if you're playing her off field, and it's her skill. And as it so happens, we already have a weapon that synergizes with skill. The Eye's signature weapon, where every time you use your skill, you gain elemental skill damage bonus up to 3 times, and when you get 3 stacks, you gain an additional 12% all damage bonus. Now, Nahida's E has a 5-second cooldown, and this isn't when it hits, it's when you use your skill, which means that you will start with your E, you'll get the 12%, then on your second E, you'll get 24%, and then on your third E, you'll get 36% plus the 12, so 48%. Depending on what setups you do and what teams you end up using, that can happen relatively early into your chamber. If you're fighting, for example, Magu Kenki, you can start the chamber with E, and then press E 5 seconds later, and then get the third E as soon as he starts doing his things. There are teams where this will be harder. For example, a Sino team, you can't swap into Nahida every 16 seconds, which means you lose your stacks between rotations. But as it turns out, actually looking at the damage distribution, I made a bunch of sheets today. If you look at off-field with Quicken, with an average of 1.5 stacks, Kagura's is her second best weapon. If you look at on-field with Quicken, with an average of 2.5 stacks, it can actually outdamage her signature weapon. Obviously, her signature weapon gives EM to the rest of your team, but point is basically, if you have Kagura's, don't waste your money on fucking Floating Dreams. Lost Prayers, solid on-field. If you off-field, you're not gonna get stacks on Lost Prayers, and that makes it kind of It's still fine because it's a 33.1% crit rate weapon, so that's nice, but it's nothing crazy. Skyward Atlas, okay. It's in competition with some pretty good 4-stars, so it's very possible, if not likely, that you have better options on your account. Wandering Evenstar is one of the new weapons. 24% of your EM is converted to bonus attack, and 30% of that bonus attack is also given to your other party members. On Nahida, you'll generally end up with an EM stat weapon, anywhere between 550 and 1,000 EM, sometimes a bit more. In teams where you'd want to use that, generally between 550 and 1,000, so that's around 150 attack, with around 50 attack as a buff to party members. If you go up to 1,000, that's around 240 with around 80 attack as a buff to party members. If you get for high refined and 1,000 EM, that's almost 500 attack and about 150 to your other party members. It's not bad. It's definitely not worth going for on a banner. As you can see, right, a high refined ends up being a pretty solid option. Hakushin, meh. It has the same issue as the other ER weapons, where it's wasting a substat, giving you energy recharge. But if you play off-field Nahida in teams where she just doesn't end up doing that much damage, if you've got a relatively low investment Nahida, you want to pull for her character, but you don't have the resources to level her all that much, then getting a buff weapon or a support weapon like Hakushin can have some value. She does get 20% or 10% up to 20 at Refinement 5 elemental damage for her dendro damage, on top of giving 20% electro damage. It's just a meh overall. Blackcliff is a bit difficult to gauge because it's really hard to get Blackcliff stacks on off-field characters. So for off-field, it's generally like pretty bad. For on-field characters, it can be a little bit better, but even then, Nahida's damage distribution isn't her doing all the damage. Part of her value is that she's Dendro, and that Dendro is really good at synergizing with other off-field damage dealers. So even when you on-field her, she's not the main source of damage. Like, she's not more than half your DPS, basically. And because you only get the stacks on Blackcliff, if the enemy dies to the damage of the character that's using Blackcliff, then it's pretty hard to get stacks on Blackcliff on her. And so even though it can end up cheating okay, practically most of the time it won't be very good. Mappa Mare is a very solid free-to-play option. However, the buff that Mappa Mare gives you, 8% damage buff, it lasts for 10 seconds, so if you off-field your Nahida, it can be hard to actually keep that up. If you do end up keeping that up, that's nice, that's bonk. If you don't, it can actually end up being pretty rough. In my off-field comparison, I was assuming that you actually end up getting relatively bad uptime on it, right? And as you can see, it ends up performing quite a bit worse in Magic Guide, even at high refinement. But when you go for on-field things, it can actually be quite a bit better. Another reason for that is because when you're on-fielding, some of your damage is going to start coming from your normal attacks, and your normal attacks don't have an EM scaling like your elemental skill does, right? Your normal attacks are just attack scaling, which means that weapons with higher base attack benefit more from being on-field than 3-star weapons do, which is part of why on the off-field comparison, Magic Guide is so high, and on the on-field comparison, it's so low. I'd say good free-to-play on-field. Solar Pearl also has the same issue that a lot of weapons do, which is 6 seconds. So if you off-field your Nahida, most of the time she won't actually have this buff. But if you on-field your Nahida, she can kind of just keep permanent uptime on it. It's also a crit weight weapon, so it can actually be quite good on on-field Nahida. On-field, Solar Pearl at high refinement is actually tickling the 5-star weapons. The specific set of assumptions I'm using here is a little bit unfavorable to 1,000 Floating Dreams. I would still say that this weapon is slightly better than our 5 Solar Pearl overall. All this to say, right, if you have a Solar Pearl at high refine and you want to play on-field Nahida, you don't really have an incentive to go for a 5-star weapon. Obviously though, if you end up off-fielding her, if you end up getting different teams where you don't Hyperbloom as much, so attack percent gains some value, flat attack gains some value, base attack gains some value, then you can actually have those comparisons shift. Here in this case, Solar Pearl worse than Magic Guide, for example. So it won't always be better, but it is a very strong option when it's good. So situationally best 4-star. Sac frags. Okay, I am a Sacrificial Fragments enjoyer. I love sac frags. I think it's fucking pog. For Nahida, she does want Elemental Mastery, so the sac frag subside is good for her. The effect doesn't give her any stats, but it does give her potential cooldown reset on her P. Now, your initial reaction to that might be that, well, it's a 5-second cooldown E, that doesn't do that much. And to some extent, that's kind of true. But even the not that much is 1 more E, and the E does have a damage that it does. But then on top of that, like the E initial hit, the cast of it, doesn't have internal cooldown, which means that 1 additional E is also 1 additional spread. And that can actually be quite valuable. In teams where she doesn't end up doing that much damage to begin with, because she's off-field, getting 1 more spread can actually be a pretty significant difference, to the point where Sacrificial Fragments is actually one of her best weapons. Most definitely one of her best 4-star weapons. When it comes to on-field things, though, it ends up dropping quite a bit, because you're dealing more damage to begin with, so 1 more spread is comparatively less of an increase. But I would argue that Sacrificial Fragments is also situationally a best 4-star. And then Widsith is also situationally the best 4-star. What Widsith does is it gives you a very, very large buff that doesn't last for very long with a very long cooldown. Getting back to this, right, I actually lied. I hid this from you. Unhide. The top of it is Widsith. Well, this is Widsith with the Elemental Mastery buff active. If you can kill enemies in 10 seconds, Widsith is your best choice. But if you can't, and you end up getting average uptime on Widsith, then it drops down quite significantly. Widsith is very interesting in that it's a 4-star weapon that's almost more of a whale weapon than actual 5-star weapons. Because the situations where Widsith is really, really good is when you have so much investment in your characters that you can one-shot shit. That being said though, it's not just when you're a whale that you can one-shot shit. Sometimes you'll have 2 waves of enemies, with the first wave not being that tanky. Having Widsith to one-shot that first wave can actually end up making it so that the setup for your second wave is easier to to do. There's a lot of situations where having front-loaded damage can be very valuable. Let's say you're fighting Magu Genki. It's nice to be able to front-load your damage. Because Widsith happens when you swap into your character, if you put Nahida on your slot number 1, you don't proc the Widsith passive when you start the chamber. So you can use your E on Nahida, swap out, get Magu Genki to his invulnerable phase, wait until he's not invulnerable anymore, and then swap to Nahida, get the Widsith buff, and one-shot the fuck out of him. Point being, the ability to front-load things is always nice to have. It's not always good, it's not always valuable, it's not always the thing you want, but sometimes it is. And so, situationally, Widsith can be her best 4-star weapon. Fav Codex. Nahida seems to generate 3 particles when her Trikarma proc with a cooldown that we don't know yet. It seems to be like 7 to 8 seconds. So realistically, on a 20-second rotation, she'll get 2 to 3 sets of particles. If you want to be able to use her burst, like to chain your burst, you want to be okay with 2 sets of particles, which is going to be 6 dendro particles. And if you're playing her off-field, she's not catching them. Let's do 2 different energy counts, one for off-field and one for on-field Nahida. Which is 39 energy, which would mean that she wants to have around 130 ER. If you play her off-field, you're getting quite a bit higher energy requirements if you want to use your burst every rotation. If you end up playing her off-field, she's not as reliant on her burst, obviously, as someone like DMC. Like, she still does things even if she doesn't burst, but ideally you'd like to. I haven't actually included the energy requirements on her personal damage, but if you are going to be looking at energy requirements, stuff like Fav Codex obviously gains a lot of value. Similar for Fruit of Fulfillment, Hakushin Ring. I still wouldn't recommend them over the other options you have, but Fav Codex, potentially. And I guess Hakushin as well, potentially. Her burst won't always matter that much off-field because it's not always that your on-field character is going to want the EM buff from it. And if they don't, then it's not that valuable. But she does have some energy requirements. And if you go Favonius, those disappear, so that's good. So that's another advantage that Favonius has. But yeah, so Favonius is overall just a pretty solid option that I most definitely underestimated. It's a lot better than I gave it credit for. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the best 4-star option in some situations when the rest of your team actually does need the energy generation and you have a pretty high refine on it. Magic Guide is actually pretty good. Like we looked at earlier, there will be situations, for example, off-field, where it's kind of just your best free-to-play option. The biggest issue that Magic Guide has is that part of what makes it good is that it gives you damage percent against enemies affected by Electro and Hydro. But if you on-field Nahida, you're playing a lot of Dendro, and the enemies are not staying affected by Hydro or Electro. Which means that you don't get all of the damage percent from Magic Guide if you on-field Nahida. You'll only get it relatively sparsely. Is that a word? I don't know. But when you're playing off-field Nahida, because you're only applying Dendro once every 3.8 seconds at a baseline, and if you've got some Electro, once every 3.3, 3.5, whatever, then it's very easy to keep enemies affected by Electro or Hydro, which means that you always have the damage percent from Magic Guide. So you've got the damage percent, and it has an EM substat, and those things together are actually enough to make it a pretty solid weapon. And then finally, TTDS. Unironically, Nahida is a catalyst where it might be worth not running TTDS, but also she's an EM scaler, which means that running a low base attack weapon doesn't hurt her as much, which means that even though you might have a reason to go for personal damage on her, going TTDS doesn't hurt her personal damage as much as it would hurt like Ningguang's personal damage. Right? It's about 25% worse than Magic Guide, which is relevant, but that 48% attack buff could translate to more team DPS in some situations. If you end up playing her with Nilou, you just want an EM weapon. With that being said, it's relatively easy to reach quite a bit of EM in Nilou teams with Nahida, which means that even if you don't have an EM weapon, or even if you do, if you don't want to use them, there are other weapons that can actually potentially even be better. Bloom teams depend on single target versus AoE, but generally, right, her signature, Kagura's, Sac Frag, Magic Guide, that's the kind of stuff you want to stick to. I mean, I guess I should do Prototype Ember. I don't know, man. Like, it's a healing option, I guess. If you want it, go for it. But if you want a healer, use a healer. Not use Prototype Ember. Okay, let's order them in, like, the general order from best to worst. Obviously, it's going to depend on which team you use. It's going to depend on so much bullshit. And also, ranking would change if she ends up with no ICD, because she would spread more, which would make, like, attack weapons a lot worse. This is the list that we have. bad. After thinking about it more, bonus Codex would actually likely become also situationally best 4-star depending on teams. So it would just go along with the other situational 4-stars. But yeah, at the end of the day, there's not that much difference between her weapons. Like, she's got better weapons and worse weapons, but the difference between the 5-stars and the 4-stars is not that big compared to a lot of the other characters. And the difference between the good 4-stars and the bad 4-stars is actually not the end of the world. So even if you don't have one of the good weapons, it's completely fine. Okay, artifact sets. 4-piece, Deepwood. This is her set. Don't go Gilded Dreams. You can go Gilded Dreams, okay? You look at the damage difference from Gilded Dreams, and we got these. And if I replace this with a Gilded Dreams set, wow, that's so much higher. Wow, that is so cool. If you look at the on-field Nahida, wow. So depending on what team, somewhere between 10 and 25%. The thing is, that's assuming you have someone else on Deepwood. Because if you don't have someone else on Deepwood, oh wow, suddenly it's just a lot worse actually. And even on off-field, oh wow, there's a situation where it's 1.1% better?
No.
Because this is assuming 100% uptime on your Gilded Dreams. And off-field, you're far from that. You're never gonna have 100% uptime on the Gilded Dream set because you can only reactivate the buff, so gain the bonus, when you trigger a reaction, when you don't have the buff. You can only trigger the effect every 8 seconds, and the buff lasts 8 seconds, which means that every 8 seconds, you're gonna lose it, and then you're gonna regain it on your next reaction, but the next reaction will not benefit from the bonus. So, when you're playing on-field Nahida, that's not the end of the world because you're triggering enough reactions with your normal attacks, and you'll get good uptime. That maybe won't be 100, but will be relatively close, so it's fine. But when you're playing her off-field, like in Quicken teams, assuming, right, you play her in like a double electro, which means that the trigger interval minimum is going to be 1.83. Realistically, maybe you're getting one trigger every 2-ish seconds, assuming you use her burst, which means that you'll get E-cast, you don't get it. Try Karma 1, you have it. Try Karma 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This happens at time equals 0. This is like maybe 0.5, this is 2.5, etc. You get it here, you get it here, you get it here, but then you'll start getting your first one where you don't get it. You don't get the EM bonus on this hit, the first hit after 8, and then you'll regain it by triggering this hit on your next hit, which means that at 8.5, it starts over again. And then basically, if this is 6.51, you're gonna yes, 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 no. Basically, between 1 out of 3 and 1 out of 5 hits are not gonna get the bonus, depending on which team you play in. Your uptime is not 100%. It's gonna be closer to somewhere between, if you're off-field Nahida, between 60 and 80% generally. So just keep that in mind for the comparisons. If you can fit Deepwood on someone else on your team, that's nice. The thing is, Nahida doesn't lose as much damage from Deepwood as a lot of characters do from going Deepwood. So if you're playing something like Nahida, Fischl, Yai, Kazuha, or Jane, going Deepwood on one of those is not as good as going Deepwood on Nahida. If you're going Nahida, Raiden, Singso, Yelan, right, and you're doing Raiden Hyperbloom, you don't want to go Deepwood on Yelan, you don't want to go Deepwood on Singso, and you want to go Gilded on your character who's triggering Hyperbloom, your Raiden. So it's harder to do. There are definitely teams where you can afford going Deepwood. Generally, when you go something like Kokomi or when you go something like Zhongli, those units don't mind going Deepwood as much. Off-field Kokomi, by the way. Or when you play her in Nilou teams, it's pretty easy to have someone else on Deepwood. But I would say that generally, you're more likely to want Deepwood than to want Gilded Dreams. That being said, 4-piece Gilded Dreams is also good. It is quite good indeed. When it comes to the Hyperbloom teams and the Burgeon teams, you still definitely want to go Deepwood because a lot of your damage is coming from a different unit dealing Dendro damage, so you really want the Dendro Red Shred. But when Nahida is the solo Dendro on like a Quicken team, for example, the difference between Deepwood and Gilded Dreams is really not that big. So if you have a really good Gilded Dreams set, but not that great Deepwood, which is the case for me, and you're playing her specifically in Quicken team where she's the only Dendro unit, then you can actually get away with no no Deepwood set on your team and actually just go Gilded. Because Gilded's like set bonus is actually good enough that it's almost as good as the Res Shred from Deepwood. Not quite as good, but not that far behind. However, in Burning team specifically, if she's actually getting good ownership of the Burning, and she's the only source of Dendro damage, then a pretty good portion of her damage isn't actually Dendro, right? Because a pretty good portion of her damage is going to be Burning because she's building a lot of EM. And Burning is Pyro damage, not Dendro. Which means, funnily enough, that you actually want to go Gilded because the Deepwood set just doesn't increase the biggest portion of your damage, right? If we look at Nahida Burning, let's say Nahida, Diona, Ganyu, Bennett. This is Deepwood. This is Gilded. It's pretty consistently better. On high EM weapons, you get over 1000 EM, so it's not that much better, but it's still better. And then on non-high EM weapons, it is a lot better. Anyways, all this to say, specifically in burning teams, where she's getting good ownership of burning, Gilded Dream is actually better than Deepwood. Finally, we got 4-piece Steve.
Great practical joke, Jim. Got me go to the annex. No!
4-piece TF is 100% a meme, and you bet your ass I'll be doing it. Like, I will 100% be playing 4-piece TF, but I don't think it's going to be very good. We have just now had leaks for an artifact set that has 2-piece Elemental Mastery and 4-piece increase Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon damage. And the numbers on it are pretty good, which means that if the artifact does end up coming out as is, it's going to be better than Gilded Dreams in teams where you want to play Gilded Dreams and Nahida's triggering Blooms, right? Nahida can't trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon, so it's only for Nilou teams where she gets a decent amount of ownership, which is honestly arguably not really anywhere. Generally in Nilou teams, you'd rather have your Hydra units on that set, probably, and Nahida on Deepwood Memories. But it's still another thing to keep in mind. Artifact stats. Sands, EM. Goblet, damage percent, or EM. Circlet, crit, or EM. As a general rule, EM is always good, up until it's not. So let's get back to her passives. Each point of her EM beyond 200 will grant whatever, a maximum of 80% and 24% crit rate. This passive caps out at 1000 elemental mastery. So if you go over 1000 elemental mastery, your elemental mastery is just increasing this and your spread damage, but it's not giving you more damage percent or crit anymore, which means that anything past 1000 isn't as valuable as anything below 1000. If you're below 1000, EM Goblet and EM Circlet are very viable. Depending on substats, depending on which weapon you're using, they can even be better than Damage Goblet or Crit Circlet. The biggest thing to keep in mind is just going to be don't go over 1000. There are teams where you might want to go over 1000, but that's basically only the Nilou teams. It's better to be at 1000 EM with a Dendro Goblet than 1187 EM with an EM Goblet. You might think that, wow, that's 1000 EM, that's a lot, I'm never going to reach that. But, right, like I said, this is the team that I'll be playing, ones I'm excited for, with Nahida instead of Kazuha. I'm using Kazuha because Kazuha is EM Ascension. With these two, right, I'm at 651. But one of Nahida's passive is going to make it so that this 1000 EM gives my on-field, so Nahida, another 200. So that's 851. And then if I have a weapon that gives me EM, like Magic Guide, I'm already above 1000 with just 2 EM main stats. So that, like, 1000 EM mark is closer than you think it is. So generally, while if you get an EM main stat, like, it can be very good, the damage one and the crit one are going to be more versatile. That being said, because those, like, EM main stats are viable, that also means that EM substats are very good. And when farming at artifacts for Nahida and looking at artifacts for Nahida, you can consider EM rolls to be about as good as crit rolls if you're below 1000 EM. And again, right, it's not that you want to reach 1000, it's that you don't want to go above. Like, if you have 800 EM on your Nahida, that's good. Like, you shouldn't go out of your way to try to go to 1000. I think that just leaves us with the teams. Let's actually separate it. So on-field Quicken is basically like you end up using her with Fischl, Yai, Beidou, those like good all-field Electro units, and an Animo unit like Kazuha, Jean if you want, or maybe Zhongli. On-fielding your Nahida means that you don't get as many Fischl Ascension 4 procs, because the more Dendro you apply, the harder it is to maintain an underlying Electro, and as soon as you lose the underlying Electro, then you can actually have an underlying Dendro under your Quicken that makes it impossible to reapply an Electro Aura. And once that happens, if you keep on-fielding your Nahida, you're not triggering Electro reactions with Nahida, because spread doesn't count. Which means that you're not going to get a lot of Fischl Ascension 4 procs. You're going to get some, but you're not going to get a lot. Off-field Quicken, solid. Effectively, it's not that she does anything crazy, it's just that she does a pretty decent amount of damage while she does the same thing as the other units do. It's not that she does something more crazy than Dendro MC does, it's just that she does more damage. Quick swap Quicken, solid. So you're talking about stuff like you go on the field with her every once in a while. You also use a unit like Yai that can actually spend time on field, and you do spend time on field on her. You could do it with Katsing, I guess. I don't know if I'd like that very much. On field Hyperbloom, she's gonna be really good. I don't think there's much else to say. It's probably going to be her best team. Off-field Hyperbloom, honestly. I'm wondering about the possibility of playing double Dendro off-field and on-fielding an Electro unit with an off-field Hydro, or a Hydro unit with an off-field Electro. Oh wait, you know what's really funny? You can do on-field Ayato with EM Raiden, but you can also do full ER Ayato with on-field EM Raiden. Oh, I think, okay, I'm definitely gonna have some fun with that. I think it's interesting, but it's very hard to predict because it's gonna depend on like how the Dendro ends up lining up. How the Dendro application with DMC plus Nahida ends up lining up. If they do it at the same time or not at the same time. But yeah. It's interesting. It's gonna be something I'll want to test, but I'm not sure how good it will be. Could go anywhere from like playable to quite good. On-field Burgeon, nice. Slightly below solid. One more good tool in your toolbox for Burgeon stuff. Off-field burning, cope, but functional. Oh yeah, Bountiful core. It has the potential to be insane because Bountiful Bloom teams inherently have this potential of, if you have enough enemies, like staggering your application on multiple enemies to just generate an unhealthy, insane amount of seeds. Even if you're only on 2 enemies, you can still actually get large amounts of seeds. And she's likely to be the best Dendro option for this. But it's a team that, like, by design is niche. Now, how good is it inside of its niche? Probably quite strong. Outside of its niche, I don't know. If you play her on field in a Nilou team, right? I've talked about how you're gonna get a bunch of Dendro and all that, but one thing I didn't understand that well at the time was that her E is 1.5U and really like the implications of it. And also, like a fucking dumbass, I kind of forgot what her activation requirement for her E was. So Nahida's E will activate when you trigger a reaction. In Nilou teams, you only have one reaction, which means that the only way that Nahida can trigger her E in a Bloom team is if there's a Bloom reaction. That has 2 consequences. The first one being you can't play her off-field in Bloom teams as a solo Dendro because, well, she's not applying Dendro unless you're already applying Dendro and getting reactions. And off-field, that's the only Dendro she has, the one that's reliant on you triggering a reaction. So if you need a reaction to trigger a reaction, you won't trigger a reaction, and therefore you won't trigger a reaction. You need to proc her E to proc her E, but her E doesn't proc her E. And because in Nilou teams, the Bloom seeds explode after a very short period, you can't actually just like delay it like that, unfortunately. Which means in Nilou teams, if you off-field her, you're just not gonna get Blooms. You're not gonna get Dendro up. Which means you have to on-field her, which is the first consequence of that. And the second consequence of that is that it's gonna affect who is getting ownership for the reaction. When you start with a Dendro aura and you apply Hydro to it, you won't always remove the Dendro. Sometimes you'll be left with some Dendro. If that is the case when you activate Nahida's E, or when you activate the passive on her E, there will be some Dendro left, Nahida's E will hit the enemy, and it will replenish the Dendro aura. And you'll end up with a 1.5U Dendro aura. If you do Dendro into Hydro, they still have Dendro, and all that's gonna happen when you proc Nahida's E is it's gonna replenish the Dendro, which means the Dendro will be an aura. If, on the other hand, you start with a Hydro aura, and then you apply Dendro, because of the properties of the Bloom reaction, it is going to remove all of the Hydro, which means you will start with no aura, and then Nahida's E will proc, and it will immediately, as soon as you trigger the reaction, apply Dendro to the enemy. And when you apply Dendro to an enemy with no aura, it's gonna become a Dendro aura. It's technically, it's 1.2, not 1.5, but whatever, right? You're gonna have Dendro aura, which means no matter which side of the Bloom reaction you trigger, when you're on-fielding your Nahida, when her E procs, you will end up with a Dendro aura. What that means is you can very reliably make sure that your Hydro units are getting a pretty good ownership of your Blooms. When I talked about Nilou and I talked about Nahida in Nilou teams, I expected Nahida to get a pretty good ownership of Blooms, which when her E activated relatively slowly would have been the case because you would have given her E the time to get depleted and then apply Hydro and then trigger Blooms. But with the fact that it's 1.5 units of Dendro and the fact that it now has no ICD and hits every 2.5 seconds if you trigger a reaction, we're now in a situation where in Nahida teams, you're actually pretty likely that most of your ownership will be on your Hydro units and not on your Nahida. What that means is twofold. First off, it means you can get more seeds, more Blooms total. But the second thing is you want to build EM on your Hydro characters, which to some extent decreases the value of units that have very high base scalings like Xingqiu and Yelan. And in increases the value of units that don't have very high base scalings, but can apply off-field hydro, like Barbara, like Burst Ayato, stuff like that. So I could actually see Nahida teams with Kokomi plus Barbara, or Kokomi plus Ayato. I think that the biggest obstacle in those teams is unironically going to be not dying to your own blooms. Because with the amount of blooms that you should be able to trigger with Nahida, and the fact that Nahida doesn't have a lot of HP, I can actually see a world where you just die to your own blooms, even if you have both Barbara and Kokomi on your team. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's gonna be funny. But yeah, just keep that in mind. You'll still obviously have the option of going for your normal Hydro units. Because of Nilou's passives, even Hydro units that are built with no EM will still do decent bloom damage with their blooms. But yeah, it is a thing to keep in mind. After thinking about it more, you guys have already seen in the first video how the team stuff has changed, but I do want to like actually change the words I'm using here to reflect that. On-field Quicken, off-field Quicken, Quickstop Quicken will still be solid. Between like very solid and really strong, depending on what exactly the team you're using is, but she's going to be very good in that. On-field Hyperbloom still probably going to be kind of crazy. Off-field Hyperbloom, I shouldn't say it's going to be solid. It's going to be a lot like DMC is doing now. On-field Burgeon, honestly, nice. But also, I didn't talk about off-field Burgeon, and that's probably going to be solid as well. Same for this one, actually. Because off-field Burgeon, there's a few teams that care about the Dendro that Nahida can provide. And sure, she's not really doing it that much faster than Dendro main character, but in teams that actually have longer rotations than 20 seconds, where you don't actually exactly use your Dendro MC burst every 20 seconds, something like Thundering Fury, for example, every like second over 20 seconds, it decreases your DPS with DMC, but with Nahida it doesn't, because you've got your E on the enemies for 25 seconds, not just 20. So yeah, for off-field Burgeon is going to be very like pretty solid. Off-field Burning is not nearly as cope because of the way that the Ganyu mechanic I've talked about in the previous video, I think. It's gonna be like okay-ish. And then this is also gonna be solid. I could talk about Quick Bloom. It's gonna be solid as well. That is unironically the biggest problem with making a video on Nahida, is that she has too many viable team options that aren't just like cope viable, but like actually solid viable. She has too many good options. But yeah, so that's it for the teams I wanted to talk about here. I think that does it. I'm pretty excited for Nahida's release, and yeah, I'll see you around. Bye, YouTube.